greatest holy warrior. But he did not anticipate the storm that would be unleashed when Richard of England heard the holy city was back in Muslim hands. The loss of Jerusalem was a disaster for Richard and the Christians in Europe. The Pope immediately issued a decree. Jerusalem was to be recaptured at all costs. In Christianity's darkest hour, Richard prepared to take on Saladin.
Richard would have heard the name Saladin many, many times. He would have known of Saladin's huge success as the leader of the Muslim world. The opportunity to match himself against someone so famous was an opportunity not to be missed. As soon as he heard the news that Saladin had taken Jerusalem, he at once, without a moment's thought, impetuously, knowing instinctively it was the right thing to do, took the cross.
Richard received a fabric cross that all crusaders pledged to wear until Jerusalem was back in Christian hands.
Richard would know that if he could lead a crusade that recaptured Jerusalem, he would go down in the annals of history as one of the greatest heroes of Christendom. This was his time.
When Richard, the greatest knight in Europe, became a crusader, thousands followed his example. Men prepared to leave their families. The crosses sewn onto their tunics, signifying that they were now a part of Christ's army, led by Richard. Men who had never left their villages would travel 2,000 miles to join him in the fight for Jerusalem. In return, the church would forgive them all their sins, a reward for which many were ready to die.
Crusaders embarking for the Holy Land must have felt an enormous mix of emotions. They were leaving their wives, their families. They themselves were going into the unknown. They were going into lands that they hadn't seen or experienced before. They knew from previous crusades you probably had a 1 in 3 chance of dying or not coming back. So great fear, and also a sense of moral right. They felt crusading was a good purpose.
In the summer of 1190, Richard, now King of England, set sail for the Holy Land. Richard had spent a fortune on provisions. It was said he would have been prepared to sell London to aid Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, Saladin realized instead of stopping the Holy War, his actions had inflamed it. Saladin's council was becoming increasingly concerned. They knew that Richard's army was sailing to join Franks released from Jerusalem, who had regrouped 100 miles north and were now besieging the Muslim port of Acre. Acre was the key port in the eastern Mediterranean. If the Christians could seize it, they would secure a bridgehead into the Holy Land. But if Saladin could break the siege, he could force the invaders back into the sea. When Saladin arrived at Acre, he ordered his army to surround the Christian besiegers. But the Crusaders were too deeply entrenched for him to win another dramatic victory. The siege was a stalemate. Now Saladin decided to starve the Christians into submission.
Whenever you're dealing with an apologist for Islam, or even a Muslim, and you bring up jihad, almost immediately they kick back to you, well, what about those terrible crusades? Why, they're the moral justification for jihad. I mean, we're just as bad as they are, so let's not talk about jihad, okay? Let's talk about the crusades. Well, what I would like to talk about here are facts. And it turns out I sat down and put together some work, and I created a database of some 548 battles that Islam fought, jihad battles against classical civilization. And these aren't even all the battles. It really doesn't say much about Africa and India, Afghanistan and all that. It's primarily the battles against the classical civilization of Rome and Greece. So, 548 battles is a lot, and it's too much to even comprehend. So I created something which I call a dynamic battle map, in which you have a display of the Mediterranean, and a white dot means that this 20-year period, that's a new battle. So every time the screen changes, it's 20-year period. The colors white turn to red, and so you can see a history. This may seem a little confusing, but I think when you see it, you'll know exactly what I mean. And here it starts. Islam burst out of the Arabian Peninsula and immediately starts attacking the Middle East. And notice that it doesn't take long until they're crossing the Mediterranean and attacking southern France and Spain. Notice something here. Most people think of Islam, they think of Arabs, they think of desert, and yet here we see that Islam is projecting power throughout the Mediterranean. Notice how the little islands of the Mediterranean are getting hammered. The navy of Islam would attack coastal towns, kill, rob, rape, and then take slaves. So this whole battle map, as it unfolds, you're seeing slaves being taken. Over 1 million slaves were taken out of Europe into the Islamic world. That's something you don't think about much, but it's absolutely true. There were over 200 battles fought in Spain alone. And we also see, however, on the east coast in Turkey, that Islam is trying to break into Europe. Now, what's going to happen is, in Spain, this ongoing fight that lasted for 400 years, the Christians are going to push back the Muslims. But now then, what has happened over in the east is that Constantinople has fallen, and now then Eastern Europe is getting hammered. The jihad now comes to Eastern Europe. It's pushed out now of Spain. Northern Africa is now completely Islamic. The Middle East is completely Islamic. This is all jihad, relentless jihad. And why is it so relentless? Well, Muhammad was relentless in his jihad. And these people are good students of Islam, and so it's against the kafir, on and on. It was traditional that when the Sultan came to power, the brand new Sultan, he would immediately try to launch new wars, because he was going to be noted in his Islamic history as to how well he fought against the kafir. So that's what the jihad looked like over that time period, 548 battles. But remember, when you bring up jihad, people want to bring up the Crusades. So I also prepared a dynamic battle map of all the offensive raids of the Crusaders. Let's watch it and make a comparison. And so it begins. The Crusades enter into Turkey and the Middle East. Battles go on, but aren't there far fewer than you thought there might be? And here we go. The last battles are fought, and that is the end of the Crusades. So now then we can talk about some facts. Yes, there were Crusades, but notice they ended centuries ago, and Jihad is being practiced today. Jihad has been with us for 1,400 years. There is no comparison between Jihad and the Crusades, certainly not a moral comparison. And when you're looking at the Crusades, remember, in one sense, all of the Crusades were defensive wars. Why? Well, as we saw on the first Jihad map, it was Islam that came out of Arabia and conquered the Middle East, a Christian Middle East. And so the Crusaders were trying to free their Christian brothers and sisters from Jihad. So there's no moral comparison at all. The motivation of the Crusaders was to free Christians. The purpose of Jihad is to enslave the kafir. So the next time you hear somebody talk about, oh, those dreadful Crusades, you've seen some facts about the matter. Why don't you pipe up and tell them you know, you don't really know the matter.